The human was paid to please, without asking questions, until he discovered she was.
Griffin Kane leaned back in his chair, staring at the contract on his tablet. The offer was absurd. Too good to be true. Live in a luxury palace, fulfill some requests from a wealthy alien noblewoman, and never ask questions. The payout: enough credits to retire on a private moon. It had to be a scam. But according to the recruiter, it wasn't. The lady in question is very private, the man had explained. She requires a human for companionship. Discretion is required. Griffin wasn't sure if that meant romance, bodyguard duty, or something stranger. But after a series of background checks and medical scans, he found himself on a ship bound for the Zarethi Dominion. That's when the doubt started. Zarethi weren't just any alien species. They were warriors, conquerors, 7 feet tall with violet skin, piercing silver eyes, and muscles carved from stone. Their rulers were fierce, undefeated in battle. So why in the galaxy would one of them need a human for companionship? The ship docked at a towering citadel of dark metal and glowing runes. Griffin barely had time to admire the view before 2 armored guards led him down a long hall and into an enormous chamber. At the far end of the room stood Commander Valorex. She was even more intimidating than the reports had described. 7 feet of muscle and elegance, clad in black and gold armor that gleamed under the dim blue lights. Her silver eyes locked onto him with a predatory gaze, her long dark hair braided with golden rings. Griffin swallowed hard. "You are smaller than I expected," Valorex said, tilting her head. Her voice was smooth, but carried an edge of command. I can eat more," Griffin said, forcing a grin. The guards beside him visibly tensed. Valorex's lips twitched. Was that amusement? "Come forward, human." Griffin stepped closer, feeling ridiculously underdressed in his plain black jacket and boots. He expected some kind of job interview, maybe a list of expectations. Instead, Valorex lifted a curved ceremonial dagger and sliced her palm open. Deep violet blood dripped onto the floor. Griffin took a step back. "Okay, so is this like a cultural greeting or?" She grabbed his wrist before he could react. Her grip was iron. "By the ancient rites, I bind you to my house. You will stand by my side, honor my name, and serve as my consort." "Wait, what?" One of the guards stepped forward. "The bonding is sealed." Griffin blinked, his brain short-circuited. Bonding. Consort. Hang on," he said, looking around. This wasn't in the contract. Valorex raised a brow. "You agreed to serve without question. Did you think you were hired as a mere guest?" He had assumed that, yes. "You mean, this is marriage. It is the warrior's bond." Griffin's stomach dropped. He had just accidentally married an alien warlord. His recruiter was so dead. Griffin stood frozen as the reality of the situation sank in. He was married to a 7-foot-tall alien warlord. Commander Valorex turned to the gathered Zarethi warriors. "The bond is sealed." The room erupted into a chorus of clanging weapons and guttural cheers. Griffin flinched as armored warriors slammed their fists against their chests. He had no idea what was happening, but it felt important. Thanks, everyone," Griffin said, lifting a hand awkwardly. "Glad to be here. Great bonding ceremony. Very efficient." A towering Zarethi male stepped forward. His face bore deep scars across his jaw, and his armor was decorated with beast-like fangs. He scowled at Griffin. "This is the human you chose." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. Valorex shot him a glare. "Do you question my decision, General Core?" The tension in the room dropped by 10 degrees. The general clenched his jaw and exhaled through his nose. "No, Commander." Griffin wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a very bad thing. Before he could process more, Valorex gestured toward him. "You will walk with me." Griffin followed her out of the chamber and into a long, torchlit corridor. His heart still pounded. He glanced at her, trying to figure out how to approach the situation without getting stabbed. "So," he said, forcing a casual tone, "didn't think to mention the whole marriage thing before I got here." Valorex didn't even glance at him. "You did not ask." Griffin nearly choked. "Who just assumes that's part of the deal?" She finally turned to him, silver eyes gleaming. You accepted the contract without question. That is the Zarethi way. Oh, good. Because back on Earth, we usually prefer a little something called warning before lifelong commitments. Valorex smirked. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. Humans are amusing, she said. So fragile, so dramatic. Griffin groaned. This was going to be a nightmare. They entered a massive open-air courtyard. Stone pillars lined the space, draped in banners of deep crimson and gold. The scent of something spicy and metallic filled the air. Dozens of Zarethi stood around a massive feast laid out on dark stone tables. Roasted meats, glowing fruits, and strange bubbling drinks filled the space. Griffin's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since his flight. Maybe getting married wasn't all bad if it came with a feast. Valorex gestured to a seat beside hers. You will sit. Griffin hesitated. Every warrior in the room was staring at him. Then a servant placed a massive steaming platter in front of him. Some kind of roast beast with dark purple meat and what looked like crystallized honey glaze. It smelled incredible. He grabbed a piece and took a bite. The second it hit his tongue, fire exploded in his mouth. Griffin gagged, choking. Tears formed in his eyes. The heat was unreal. His entire face felt like it had been dumped in molten lava. Valorex watched, amused. The spice is meant to test endurance. Griffin slammed his fist on the table. You people are insane. The warriors around him laughed, deep and booming. Valorex leaned closer, her voice almost teasing. And yet, you still eat. Griffin realized he was already reaching for another bite. Yeah, he was doomed. Griffin wiped the sweat from his forehead. The food had nearly killed him, but somehow he survived the Zarethi feast. The warriors had cheered, clapped him on the back, which nearly knocked him off his seat, and called him things like fire tongue and bold prey. He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. Now he was being dragged into something even worse. The courtyard had been cleared. The warriors now stood in a massive circle, weapons in hand, watching with eager eyes. Griffin stood in the center, very aware that he was the only person without armor or a weapon. He turned to Valorex, who stood beside him, arms crossed over her chest. Okay, Griffin said, forcing a smile. What's happening now? She smirked. Your trial. Griffin blinked. My what? Valorex stepped forward, her silver eyes glowing under the torchlight. In Zarethi culture, a warrior's bond is earned, not given, she said. You have feasted with us. Now you must prove your worth. Griffin sighed. Let me guess. Fighting. Valorex tilted her head, a test of strength, endurance, and spirit. Griffin looked at the hulking warriors surrounding him, each one built like a walking tank. He took a deep breath. Okay, fine. I'll fight, he said, but I get to choose my opponent. The warriors rumbled in amusement. Valorex raised an eyebrow. Who do you choose? Griffin pointed directly at her. The entire courtyard fell silent. Valorex stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a full, deep laugh that made some of the warriors shift uncomfortably. You wish to challenge me? She asked. Griffin grinned. You're the one who bonded with me, right? If I have to prove myself, shouldn't it be to you? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some warriors looked impressed. Others looked ready to watch him die. Valorex's smirk widened. Very well, husband, she said, stepping into the ring. Let us see if you are as bold as you are foolish. The warriors roared in excitement. Griffin exhaled. He was either a genius or a dead man. The fight begins. The moment Valorex moved, Griffin barely had time to react. She was fast, too fast. 1 second, she was standing still. The next, she was lunging toward him, her fist aimed straight at his ribs. Griffin ducked, barely. He felt the wind rush past his side as her fist missed him by an inch. If that had hit him, he was pretty sure his soul would have left his body. The warriors cheered. Valorex didn't slow down. She spun, sweeping her leg toward him. Griffin jumped back, barely avoiding her kick. Okay, he needed a plan. Fighting her head-on was suicide. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster, but maybe he could outthink her. Wow, Griffin said, dodging another strike. You're really trying to kill me, huh? Valrex smirked. A trial is not meant to be gentle. He grinned. Then I guess I don't have to be gentle either. Before she could react, Griffin dropped to the ground, grabbed a handful of dirt, and flung it at her face. The dust hit her right in the eyes. Valrex stumbled back, blinking rapidly. The warriors gasped. Griffin used the chance to tackle her. He slammed into her waist, forcing her backward. She staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, she locked her arms around him mid-motion and twisted, slamming him into the ground. Griffin groaned, staring at the sky. Okay, that could have gone better. Valrex stood over him, blinking the dust from her eyes. For a second, he thought she was going to kill him. Then she grinned. The warriors erupted into laughter. Valrex extended a hand. You fight dishonorably. Griffin took her hand and let her pull him up. I fight to win. She smirked. Perhaps you will survive after all. Somewhere in Griffin's chest, his heart did something weird. He ignored it. For now, Griffin rubbed his sore back as he followed Valrex through the grand hall of the Zarethi fortress. The trial was over, and surprisingly, he was still alive. That had to count for something. The warriors had been divided in their reactions. Some laughed and clapped him on the back for his clever thinking, while others muttered about dishonorable tactics. Either way, he had survived, and that was apparently enough. Valrex, on the other hand, looked pleased. That was foolish, she said, glancing at him. Griffin smirked. Foolish or smart? Valrex tilted her head. A true warrior does not rely on tricks. Griffin raised an eyebrow. A true warrior uses whatever works. She didn't argue. Instead, she let out a low chuckle. Perhaps you are not as weak as you seem. Griffin grinned. I'll take that as a compliment. As they entered the hall, a deep voice boomed from ahead. So, the human is still breathing. Griffin turned to see a towering Zarethi warrior standing near a long banquet table. He had deep red skin, sharp gold eyes, and a massive scar across his jaw. His armor was more elaborate than the others. This guy was important. Valrex straightened her posture. Father. Griffin nearly choked on air. This guy was her father? The warrior's golden eyes studied Griffin closely. He had the same intimidating presence as Valrex, except twice as terrifying. Griffin did his best to stand tall and not look like he was seconds away from bolting for the door. Valrex's father stepped forward. The entire room fell silent. You fought my daughter, he said. His voice was deep, like rolling thunder. Griffin nodded. Yeah, you used dishonorable tactics. Griffin hesitated. Was this a trick question? I used what I had, he said carefully. The warrior's gaze didn't waver. Then he laughed. It was a deep, booming laugh that shook the walls. The human is bold, he said, looking at Valrex. This pleases me. Griffin exhaled. Was that approval? Valrex smirked. He is not without his uses. Her father turned back to Griffin. Tell me, human, do you understand what it means to be bonded to a Zarethi warrior? Griffin glanced at Valrex. I'm still figuring that out. The warrior nodded. Then you will learn, starting now. Griffin blinked. Wait. What? Lesson 1. Zarethi bonds are not one-sided. Griffin found himself dragged to another part of the fortress, following Valrex and her father down a long corridor. The torches flickered with blue fire, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Finally, they entered a large chamber filled with weapons. Griffin's stomach sank. Why do I feel like I won't like this? He muttered. Valrex's father turned to him. In our culture, a bondmate must be able to protect their warrior. This means you must be able to fight. Griffin forced a nervous laugh. I think we've already established that I'm not exactly built for Zarethi combat. Valrex grabbed a weapon from the wall, a sleek curved blade that shimmered under the firelight. She turned and held it out to him. You will learn, she said. Griffin stared at the weapon. I don't suppose I can get a training manual first. Her father let out another booming laugh. You will learn by doing. Griffin groaned. Of course I will. A test of skill. The next hour was absolute chaos. Griffin had never held a sword before, and it showed. He swung too hard, almost fell over, and nearly dropped the blade on his own foot. Valrex circled him like a predator watching weak prey. You are too stiff, she said, blocking one of his clumsy swings effortlessly. Griffin exhaled. I wasn't exactly raised to fight alien warriors, okay? She smirked. Then it is time you adapt. Griffin sighed. That was becoming a pattern. By the end of the session, his arms burned, his legs ached, and he was completely exhausted. Valrex sheathed her weapon. You are slow, weak, reckless. Griffin scowled. Thanks for the confidence boost. She stepped closer, her silver eyes locking onto his. But, she continued, voice softer, you learn quickly. Griffin blinked. Was that praise? Valrex's father nodded in approval. You may not be strong, human, but you are not worthless. Griffin let out a dramatic sigh. Wow, I feel so honored. Valrex smirked. You should. And just like that, Griffin realized his life had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. Griffin winced as he stretched his sore arms. The training session had been brutal, but at least he hadn't lost a limb. Yet, Valrex walked beside him through the fortress corridors, her expression unreadable as always. She didn't even look tired, which was both impressive and slightly unfair. I don't suppose Zerathi warriors believe in rest days? Griffin asked, rolling his shoulder. Valrex smirked. Weak bodies require rest. You will grow stronger. Griffin sighed. Why did every conversation with her feel like a battle? As they turned a corner, a group of high-ranking Zerathi officials stood waiting. Their armor was adorned with intricate golden patterns, signifying their status. Valrex's expression turned serious. Do not speak unless necessary, she whispered. Griffin's stomach twisted. That was never a good sign. The tallest official, an older Zerathi male with piercing violet eyes, stepped forward. His gaze landed on Griffin with mild curiosity. So this is the human, he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Valrex nodded. Yes, he has proven himself. The official's expression didn't change. Has he? Griffin resisted the urge to gulp. The official turned his attention fully to Griffin. Tell me, human, do you understand why you are here? Griffin hesitated. Careful, one wrong answer could make things worse. I'm here because of a contract, he said honestly, but I also understand that things are more complicated now. The official nodded slowly. At least you are aware. Griffin took a deep breath. Look, I get it. You don't think I belong here, and maybe I don't, but I'm not going to run. The officials exchanged glances. Valrex raised an eyebrow, as if she hadn't expected that response. Finally, the older Zerathi spoke again. A bondmate must be more than just a warrior. You will be tested. Griffin forced a wry smile. Of course I will. A different kind of challenge. Later that evening, Griffin sat at a long banquet table, surrounded by Zerathi warriors and officials. The room was filled with the scent of exotic roasted meats and fragrant spices. The challenge: diplomacy. Apparently, Valrex's bondmate had to demonstrate social skill as well as combat ability. That meant handling a formal Zerathi feast without causing an intergalactic incident. Valrex leaned in. Do not insult the food. Do not refuse an offering. And whatever happens, do not spill your drink. Griffin frowned. Why the drink? She smirked. You will see. A Zerathi warrior handed him a tall silver goblet. The liquid inside shimmered like molten gold. Griffin sniffed it. It smelled spicy. A warrior across the table, a muscular Zerathi woman with deep red skin and sharp yellow eyes, raised her own goblet. To the human, she declared. May he survive the night. The others laughed. Griffin really didn't like the sound of that. Valrex gave him a pointed look. Drink. Griffin sighed and took a sip. The moment the liquid hit his tongue, his entire mouth felt like it was on fire. His eyes widened. It was the spiciest thing he had ever tasted. His body locked up. He couldn't cough, couldn't speak. His throat felt like it had turned to lava. The warriors burst into laughter. Ah, one chuckled. The human feels it now. Griffin struggled to keep his composure. His eyes watered. His face burned. Valrex smirked. Do not spill your drink. Griffin glared at her. Oh, she was enjoying this. With sheer willpower, he swallowed and placed the goblet back on the table. The warriors nodded in approval. He did not spit it out, one said. That is respectable. Griffin exhaled, forcing a grin, glad to be of entertainment. The warriors laughed again, this time with genuine warmth. Valrex leaned in, amusement in her silver eyes. Not bad, human. Griffin shook his head. This was the hardest job he had ever taken. Rising tension. As the feast continued, Griffin slowly adapted. The food was strong, the customs were strange, but he learned to follow Valrex's subtle cues. By the end of the meal, the atmosphere had shifted. The warriors still viewed him as an outsider, but there was a hint of respect now. Valrex's father studied him. You have endured combat and fire wine. Perhaps you are not completely useless. Griffin let out a dramatic sigh. Wow, another glowing review. Valrex smirked. You should be honored. The warriors chuckled. But as the night ended, Griffin couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Something he wasn't prepared for. Griffin sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the battle-worn armor Valrex had given him. It was sleek, dark, and intimidating, designed to withstand heavy blows. But no amount of armor would protect him from what was coming. The feast had been a test. And now, the real challenge would begin. A knock sounded at the door. Before he could respond, Valrex stepped inside, her silver eyes focused and unreadable. You will meet the High Warlord at dawn, she said. Griffin frowned. Another test. Valrex crossed her arms, something bigger. She hesitated, then sighed. You must agree to a trial by honor. Griffin blinked. That didn't sound good. And what happens if I fail? Valrex met his gaze. Then you die. The High Warlord's decision. The next morning, Griffin stood in the center of the Grand War Hall, surrounded by towering Zerathi warriors. The air was thick with tension. At the far end of the chamber sat the High Warlord, an older Zerathi male with dark crimson skin and piercing silver eyes like Valrex. His long battle-scarred cloak draped over his heavy armor, a symbol of countless victories. He studied Griffin for a long moment before speaking. You have impressed my warriors, human. You have survived our food, our trials, and my daughter's wrath. Griffin tried not to smirk. That last part had been the hardest. The warlord's voice grew serious. But if you wish to remain at Valrex's side, you must prove something greater. Griffin straightened, and that is, the warlord's silver eyes locked onto him, that you are willing to fight for her. The room fell silent. Griffin felt Valrex tense beside him. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was warrior politics. Griffin exhaled. All right, what's the trial? The warlord leaned forward. You must duel in the arena, a fight with no rules. Griffin stood inside the circular stone arena, gripping the unfamiliar hilt of a Zerathi combat blade. The blade was heavier than he expected, its curved edge designed for close-quarters combat. Across from him stood his opponent, a towering Zerathi male named Korvek. His armor gleamed under the high suns, and his sharp yellow eyes were filled with amusement. This is foolish, Korvek said, twirling his blade. A human cannot win. Griffin rolled his shoulders. Good thing I don't need to win. I just need to survive. A horn sounded. The fight began. Korvek lunged, moving faster than any creature that size had the right to. Griffin barely dodged in time. The blade sliced through the air, missing his ribs by inches. Think, Griffin, you can't overpower him. Korvek swung again. This time, Griffin used his smaller size to duck and roll under the strike, coming up behind him. He slashed at the back of Korvek's knee, not to kill, but to slow him down. Korvek snarled, stumbling slightly. Good, a small opening. But then, Griffin's luck ran out. Korvek spun and slammed the flat of his blade into Griffin's chest. The impact sent him flying backward. He crashed onto the ground, his vision blurring. Pain shot through his ribs. Okay, that hurt. Valrex's voice rang out from the crowd. Get up, human. Griffin groaned, easy for her to say. Korvac stalked toward him, his blade raised. Yield. Griffin gritted his teeth. No chance. With a deep breath, he reached into his boot, where he had hidden a smaller knife. Korvac raised his blade for the final strike. At the last second, Griffin twisted and drove the knife into the side of Korvac's gauntlet. The warrior jerked back, his grip faltering. It wasn't a deadly wound, but it was enough. Griffin seized the opportunity. He snatched Korvac's sword right out of his hands and pointed it at his throat. The arena fell deathly silent. Korvac's chest heaved. He looked at Griffin, then at the blade in his hands, and then he laughed. The warlord stood. The human has won. A roar of approval filled the arena. Griffin let out a long breath. He was still alive. Valrex stepped forward, her silver eyes smoldering with something unreadable. Not bad. Human, she murmured. Griffin smirked, starting to like me yet. Valrex's lips curved slightly. Perhaps. But before Griffin could relax, the warlord spoke again. The duel was only the beginning. Now, the true test begins. Griffin sighed. Of course it did. Griffin wiped the sweat from his forehead, still gripping the Zarathi combat blade. His ribs ached, his breathing was heavy, and his legs felt like jelly. He had won the duel, but at what cost? The High Warlord's voice echoed through the arena. You have proven yourself in battle, human, but one test remains. Griffin groaned. There's always one more test, isn't there? The warlord stood, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. You claim to stand beside my daughter. To do so, you must prove you are more than a fighter. You must prove you are worthy of our legacy. Griffin frowned. And how exactly do I do that? The warlord's silver eyes gleamed. You must complete the trial of the void. The crowd fell silent. Even Valrex tensed beside him. Griffin glanced at her. Okay, that sounds bad. How bad are we talking? Valrex's voice was low. No outsider has ever survived it. A leap into the unknown. Minutes later, Griffin stood at the edge of a massive underground cavern. A bottomless pit stretched before him, its depths swallowed in darkness. Torches flickered along the jagged rock walls, casting eerie shadows. Griffin stared down. You want me to jump into that? The warlord nodded. The void is a sacred place. It will test your mind, body, and spirit. If you survive, you will be one of us. If you fail. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Valrex stepped closer, her usual confidence replaced by a flicker of concern. Griffin, you don't have to do this. Griffin smirked. If I back out now, does that mean you like me? She narrowed her silver eyes. It means I don't want to see you die, idiot. Griffin exhaled, looking at the abyss once more. No outsider had ever survived. But then again, he had made a career out of doing the impossible. He took a deep breath. Then he jumped. The depths of the void. For a moment, there was nothing, just endless falling. Then, impact. Griffin landed hard, rolling over rough stone. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to his feet. Total darkness surrounded him. No torches, no stars, nothing but an endless void. Then, the whispers started. They came from nowhere, dozens of voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The air grew thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in. Griffin clenched his fists. It's just a trick. A test. Keep moving. He took a step forward, then stopped. A figure stood in front of him. His heart froze. It was his own reflection, but wrong. The shadowy version of himself grinned, its eyes glowing silver. Why do you fight so hard, human? The voice whispered. You don't belong here. Griffin forced a smirk. I don't belong anywhere. That's my whole thing. The shadow tilted its head. And yet, you chase something you'll never have. Griffin narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? The shadow took a step closer. Her. The air grew colder. You think Valrex will ever see you as her equal? The voice taunted. You are an amusement, a novelty. Griffin's jaw tightened. It was lying. Right. The shadow's grin widened. Even if you survive this trial, you will never truly be one of them. Griffin exhaled slowly. The void wasn't testing his body, it was testing his mind. He stared at his dark reflection and smirked. You talk too much. Then he did the only thing that made sense. He walked straight through the shadow. It howled, dissolving into mist. The darkness began to lift. Emerging from the abyss. Griffin's vision blurred as he stumbled forward. His legs ached, but he didn't stop. Then, light. A hidden doorway at the cavern's end swung open, revealing the outside world. Griffin stepped through, blinking against the bright twin suns. He had done it. The warlord stood at the entrance, watching him carefully. The crowd behind him was silent. Then, without a word, the warlord nodded. The warriors erupted into cheers. Griffin grinned through the exhaustion. He had survived. Valrex approached, arms crossed. I can't believe you made it. He smirked, starting to like me yet. She didn't answer. Instead, she just grabbed his collar and kissed him. The crowd roared. Griffin barely had time to register what happened before she pulled away, smirking. Don't get cocky, human. He chuckled. Too late. The celebration had barely begun when the High Warlord raised his hand. Silence fell instantly. Griffin, still catching his breath, straightened. He had survived the void, won the duel, and impressed an entire warrior race. But something about the warlord's expression told him it wasn't over. The trial of the void has judged you worthy, the warlord declared. But there is one last matter to decide. Griffin sighed. Of course there is. Valrex shot him a look, but he ignored it. He was too tired to be polite. The warlord stepped forward, his silver eyes locked onto Griffin's. You have proven your strength, your mind, and your spirit. But one question remains. Will you stay? Griffin's breath caught. Stay, he repeated. The warlord nodded. You have walked our path, fought our battles. Now you must decide. Will you truly become one of us? A murmur ran through the crowd. Griffin felt Valrex's gaze on him. He turned, meeting her eyes. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She had never asked him to stay. She had never given him a reason to believe this was more than a temporary arrangement. But now, the way she watched him, the way she had kissed him in front of her people, it meant something. Didn't it? Griffin exhaled, rubbing his jaw. And if I say no? The warlord's voice was calm. Then you leave. Forever. The weight of the words hit him like a punch. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about choosing a future, a life he never expected. Griffin had never belonged anywhere. Earth had been a mess of dead-end jobs and bad decisions. The galaxy had offered money, adventure, and chaos. But now, for the first time, he had a place, a people who had tested him, fought him, and now accepted him. More than that, he looked at Valrex again. She wasn't just watching him. She was waiting. But she wouldn't ask. She was too proud, too Zerethi. Griffin licked his lips, then smirked. I have a condition. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. No one gave conditions to the High Warlord. The warlord's eyes narrowed. Speak. Griffin crossed his arms. If I stay, I'm not just some warrior under your command. I keep who I am. I keep my own way of thinking, my own ideas. I'm not about to become some stiff-necked battle monk. A long silence followed. Then, laughter. Not just from the warlord, but from the gathered warriors. Griffin blinked. Was that funny? The warlord grinned. You misunderstand. Human, we do not ask you to become one of us by abandoning yourself. We ask you to stand beside us as you are. Griffin exhaled. Then I guess I'm staying. A thunderous cheer erupted. Valrex arched an eyebrow. Guess? Griffin smirked. Yeah, you're really bad at hiding how much you'd miss me. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. A warrior's welcome. The warlord raised a ceremonial blade, its edge gleaming in the torchlight. Then let it be known. Griffin, son of no world, now stands as one of the Zerathi. The warriors pounded their chests in salute. Griffin stood tall. This wasn't what he had planned. But for the first time in his life, he didn't need a plan. He had found something better. Something real. Valrek stepped beside him, arms crossed. You know, staying means taking responsibility. He grinned. Yeah, you gonna be my trainer? Her silver eyes glowed, something like that. Griffin's stomach dropped. Oh, stars help me. The warriors laughed, the torches burned bright. And for the first time, Griffin truly belonged.